I will share with you this. I think that this tweet from a Twitter account that I don't think that is there anymore is telling the whole story. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make the US manufacturing non-competitive. Well, global warming is something completely different. But Trump did not only talk. Trump was also working exactly in this direction. And he did, throughout this period, a few things that will have to be turned around. He made around 160 significant rollbacks of environmental regulation. He withdrew from the Paris Treaty. He actually diminished the number of people dealing with environment throughout the US administration. Of course, we are all dealing with the East Mediterranean, and I think that whatever happens in Washington has a significant and important influence of what will happen in our region. When I say our region, I refer, of course, to the East Mediterranean. Let me give you, in just a snapshot, a few words about three environmental issues and the way they are in our lives and what kind of potential they have if they will not be taken care of in the most needed way. If I start with the up north on the Turkey, Syria, and where the Turks build the great Anatolia project, 22 dams, 19 power plants, 17,000 square kilometers of irrigation, 7 airports, a huge one. You can see on the map on the right-hand side that it is both the Tigris and the Euphrates that are being there. However, Turkey is upstream of Syria, and that caused a significant reduction in the quantity and quality of water flowing from the Turkish side to the Syrian side. This by itself had some influence on the breakout of the civil war in Syria 10 years ago, because it forced people to immigrate from or to migrate from these areas that were actually influenced by this reduction and find themselves in the suburbs of the cities being a hot bath for anti-regime thoughts. So Turkey in that sense did not only think in terms of what happened in the past, but it is using, even nowadays, water as part of its way for influencing this region. We all understand that if this issue of water will not be solved, the ability to stabilize the northern part of Syria that is on the border with Turkey, without addressing the water issues there, I doubt it very much. And since we know that relations between Turkey and Erdogan and Trump, I'm sure you have discussed it throughout the week, I can assure you that even in this meeting, this issue was not raised at all. If I'm going a little bit down south to the lower Jordan River, where water are of major importance, but still low politics in the sense that there are other issues that people are listening to, terror, statehood, etc. It is a strategic asset, because if we look on the eastern side of the Jordan River, we see Jordan. And as you can see, Jordan is one of the most 10 scarce of water countries in the world. It has this brown color that covers Jordan throughout, means that there is less than 500 cubic meter per capita per year. This is lower of the lowest. So in our mind, we have to think of water in Jordan, not only for the sake of Jordan, but also for the stability of the kingdom. Don't forget that Jordan when you look at what is happening in Iraq, when you are thinking of what happened in Syria in the last 10 years, you understand the importance of Jordan as a stabilizing factor in this area. So Israel on its side is doing its utmost to assist, also by having a huge desalination program that allow it to give more water to Jordan. But this is something that one should address it. And I did not hear the Trump administration being very carefully listening to the needs in this direction. And of course, what we see now is only the beginning, because climate change means less precipitation, means a deeper and longer drought in our area. So this idea that we need strategically to keep Jordan with enough water for its citizens is of utmost importance. I think that if you look at the face of the king of Jordan while he met President Trump, it speaks for itself. The last, but maybe the most important part of it is, again, an example. It looks, we are looking at the Nile, and these are words of the late president of Egypt, Morsi, who said on the Nile, by one drop, our blood is the alternative. Now, what I'm actually talking about, you look at this map and you say, this is not East Mediterranean. You're taking us to Ethiopia, to take us almost south of Khartoum. How that is has anything to do with us? Well, I can tell you that if Egypt will lose water enough in order to destabilize the regime there, we in the East Mediterranean will suffer a weakness of a very important player. Now, what happened is that Ethiopia has its own legitimate needs for energy, and Ethiopia has about 60 to 70% of its population without electricity at all. And it was looking for a way to overcome this gap and maybe also to become an exporter of energy. And they have chosen this place not far away from the Sudanese border that you see surrounded with the red circle, in order to build the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. A huge dam. We are talking about a second biggest in Africa, seventh biggest in the world. We are talking about 70 billion cubic meter of water that will be in the storage, almost 2,000 square kilometers of a new lake that will appear there. And of course, raising worries, raising anxiety, suffering on the Egyptian side, because as we saw, one drop of water. And not only that Egypt depend 97% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile, but a good portion of its electricity comes from the Aswan Dam, where the Nile is of major importance. Ethiopia is building it since 2011. Throughout those years, there were many attempts to come to an agreement, but there is no agreement between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt on how to do it. Since 2015, in a way, Egypt recognized that the dam will be built and is concentrating nowadays of how many years it will take to build and to fill in the storage behind the dam. And still there is a big gap on this issue, how many years it will take between 15 to 5, and what will be the operation mode of it. However, in the late 2019, 8 years after it was start building, the administration of Trump felt and understood that there might be a war between two of its biggest allies in this region, And you can see in the picture President Trump with the foreign ministers of the three countries involved. He nominated Mnuchin to be the going in between. Unfortunately, he could not do that. On the way, he thought that by pressuring Ethiopia, he will find it, and he, in a way, was not successful. This is a picture from July 2020. The first batch of the storage is already in place, 7 billion cubic meter, and Trump, from that sense, is I would say, in a different place, because in what you can see, actually, this is the photo when he's talking on the telephone with the Prime Minister of the transition government of Sudan, and he says to him, they, the Egyptians, will end up blowing the dam. And by that, I don't say that he is legitimizing it, but he's certainly looking at it in a different way that we would expect. Three major issues and many others. I was talking about the periphery, and Dr. Tsafos will talk on the very heart of it, of the energy, so I leave that aside. But I would say a couple of words about what we should expect. We see a president that doing the climate leader summit, being on the side of Obama, he did his utmost for that. And he's planning now to have a completely different approach to climate. Of course, he is not a denial of climate change, and he is have a very precise and detailed program of what should be done. Of course, at the moment, he is concentrating on the US, and by that, he is setting the scene to do many other things. You can see what he is expecting to do in the US. And the question that we ask ourselves is how that will influence what I was talking about. Let me give a very short list just for us to discuss it later on in more. First of all, we will be, I hope, refocusing attention, capacity, and ability to deal with those issues by giving more resources. I hope that we will incorporating environmental consideration as part of the overall policy. One cannot talk about the East Mediterranean without looking at energy, without looking at water, without looking at air pollution. He will be in different positions by leading leaders after setting the example in Washington to change their own policies and bring environment into the very heart of their overall strategy. He will enlarge the scope of issues which will assist stabilizing the region, because he will not talk only about arms deals, but also a few very important environmental issues, for example, the Red Dead project. He will bring back hydro diplomats, which the first to lose their jobs in the State Department were people who were dealing with water. And I hope he will bring the agencies again, not only to their power and glory within the US, but also in our region. I was working with the EPA for many years in our region, and then they had to withdraw. I was a part of USAID project, and I hope that this will grow itself. And of course, America can help by investment and technologies into environment-related issues. So all that is in order to put a few bullet points for us to discuss once we get to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Aviram. So we're going to pass it over to Dr. Nikos Tsafos.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. What I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about what the last 10 years have looked like in the region in terms of energy and where we may be headed. And I guess one big takeaway that I'd like to leave with you is that We do have a new administration that's going to be sworn in here in Washington in a week or less than a week. But just as significant for the region's energy picture is that we also have a relatively new commission in Brussels. And the focus on the EU Green Deal could be as important in how we think about the region and its energy picture as the shift in administration in the United States. So just by way of a little bit of background, when we talk about energy in the East Med, most people start the clock around 2009, the first discovery of the Tamar field in Israel took place. And so since then, we've had almost a major discovery every year, more or less, from 2009 in Israel, in Cyprus, and in Egypt. And so for the most part, the questions that have preoccupied people in that decade have been sort of two questions. One, what happens to these resources? How are they developed? Where do they go? Will they be developed? Questions of that nature. And the second is, what are the political ramifications of those resources? Are they going to be used to foster new collaboration and new partnerships? Are they going to become a source of conflict and tension between the countries in the region and outside players? And so I wanted to talk about those two questions. But before doing that, just some contextual comments. One, obviously the world has changed a lot since 2009 when the first discovery was made in Israel. 2009 was before the Greek crisis. It was before the Arab Spring and the civil wars in Syria and Libya. It was a time that Obama had just come into office. It was before the war between Russia and Ukraine. It was also in energy terms a very different world. Many years before the Paris Agreement, solar and wind technologies were far more expensive. Back then, we barely had deployed electric vehicles. Climate was important, but much lower on the agenda. And it was also a time for the United States before the boom in oil and gas production in the United States. So, when President Trump talks about America being number one as a producer of oil and gas, that wasn't really the case in 2009, and that wasn't the outlook for the United States in 2009. So what I want to say is that these discoveries were made in a very different world. And so the initial ideas about what they mean and what they could do, they were part of a very different understanding of the energy system and, of course, of the regional system. So that's context number one. Context number two is the discoveries that we found were important for the region. But to be very candid, they weren't that big. The way I think about it is, if you look at just the region, they were important. If you scroll out and you look at Europe and the region, the volumes become less significant. And if you zoom out further into the world, the resources are just not that big. The way I like to describe it is, when East Med people talk about the East Med, they talk about energy. When energy people talk about energy, they don't talk about the East Med, right? The center of gravity of energy and climate is not the Eastern Mediterranean. Even in the context of European energy, the volumes that we have are not that significant. So those are some contextual comments. So let's now talk about the two core questions that I put up front. What happened to the resources? How are they going to be developed? And what are the political dimensions of those resources? So the first question is, we have in this decade actually developed a lot of the resources that have been discovered. I think sometimes when you read the press, you get the impression that we have found these resources, and if only we could collaborate better, we would be able to exploit them. I think that's the impression one gets if you read the press. And I don't think that's an accurate description of what's happening. For the most part, the resources that have been discovered have been developed. So what has happened to those resources? Well, in 2009, when the discovery of Tamar in Israel was made, the system of energy, of natural gas in particular, in the region was as follows. Egypt was an exporter of gas through liquefied natural gas to the world. And Egypt was exporting gas by pipeline to Israel and to Jordan primarily. There was a little bit of gas that went further north. So even in 2009, when the first discovery, the first sort of new discovery was made, there was already regional trade, and there was already exports from the region to the world, including to Europe, by the way. 10 years ago, the East Med was a bigger supplier to Europe of gas than it is today, right? So these discoveries didn't come in a vacuum, right? They came on top of a pre-existing system. So what happened was, over time, the system changed. Israel became essentially self-sufficient. The gas from Egypt dried up after the Arab Spring. Israel was able to develop this gas for its own needs. It was able to reduce coal use and therefore reduce CO2 emissions and local air pollutants. The air is much clearer in Israel because of the use of natural gas. And it was also turning itself into a regional exporter, selling gas to Jordan, and starting this year also to Egypt. In the case of Jordan, Jordan was importing gas from Egypt in 2009, 10, 11, 12. Then the gas went away, just as it did for Israel after the Arab Spring. They turned actually to oil because they had to sort of keep the lights on, which is the most expensive and very polluting fuel for keeping the lights on. And they also turned to LNG, liquefied natural gas. So they tried to meet their needs from outside the region to sort of counter the insecurity that they felt by losing Egyptian gas. And for Egypt, the picture was, because of an unattractive investment environment, basically the Egyptians couldn't keep production high enough to sustain their exports. And so exports started to fall. And then in 2015, they have this new discovery of the Zohr field. And what Zohr did was basically turn things around for Egypt. So Egypt was becoming an importer, and then they found Zohr, they produced it, and they became an exporter again. So what this means is that at the end of the day, when you look at the picture in the region, what you see is most of the discoveries have been developed already. Most of them have been developed for either domestic consumption in the countries where the resource was found, or for regional trade. What hasn't happened is the only country that has yet to develop its resources really is Cyprus. They're the ones that are sort of being left out. They haven't really been able to develop the resources, largely for commercial reasons, not because of tensions with Turkey, but that's something we can talk about if you want. And what also hasn't happened is, when the discoveries were first made, both in the United States and in Europe, because we always think of the connectivity between the East Med and Europe, and it was also a time when Europe was looking at the Caspian and Azerbaijan to bring gas in and to diversify its resource dependence on Russia. There was a keen interest in sort of 2009, 10, 11, 12 to see, can we bring this gas from the East Med to Europe, either through a pipeline or through liquefied natural gas? And this was also something that the United States was very interested in. And frankly, this just hasn't happened. We just haven't seen sufficient progress made on any of those ideas. And so I think one of the lessons that I take from looking at the East Med from an energy perspective is that even though there was a political momentum and a desire to sort of bring the East Med and to think of the East Med in the context of European energy security, in practice, the East Med was its own thing. And the trade between the countries took place based on bilateral agreements and on private company decisions. And you were never really able to connect this system to the European Union in the way that I think folks in Brussels thought sort of up until 4 or 5 years ago. And some folks in the US still think might happen. And some folks in the region still think might happen. There's still sort of some push to create that connection between the East Med and sort of mainland Southeast Europe, sort of going through Greece and into the Balkans and Italy. So let me now talk a few minutes about the politics of this and what we have seen. I think from the beginning of the discoveries back in 2009, there was a sense that this could be an impetus for greater collaboration regionally, that this could be a foundation for closer ties. There are some folks that draw the analog with the coal and steel community, that it was sort of an energy related basis for what is today the European Union. And that, that's very lofty and aspirational. I think in practice, it hasn't really lived up to that expectation. What we have seen is countries have been able to sort of develop new relationships using energy as an excuse to meet. The relationships between Greece and Israel are as good as they've ever been. The relationship between Greece and Egypt have been much stronger, in part because of energy. Cyprus and Israel as well. So there's definitely been the ability to use the excuse of energy to meet and to develop ties. One could argue about how deep those ties are. I happen to think that they're a little bit superficial, but if you have to pick between bad relations, no relations, or superficial relations, I'll take superficial good relations because that's far better. What we haven't really seen is, my way of thinking about the world, and in particular this region, I think bears it out, is that energy follows politics much more than the other way around. So if there is a good political relationship between countries, they have used energy to strengthen that relationship. Or if there is an appetite to collaborate, you use energy to collaborate further. What energy hasn't been able to do is, if there's a bad relationship, to use energy to sort of turn that around. That's been very rare in the region, and it's also been very rare around the world. The final thing I'll say on this politics, and then I'll say a few things about US and EU politics, is, we haven't really seen, especially in the press, if you read it, you get the impression that there's a conflict over resources that is happening in the East Med. And that too, I don't think is an accurate description of what's happening. For one, none of the resources have been discovered in disputed areas. None of the disputes, and there's lots of them, and we can talk about them if you want, have really interfered with the development of hydrocarbons. What has happened is, because of all the countries coming together to collaborate, that collaboration has really excluded Turkey, and we can talk about whether they have excluded Turkey or Turkey has excluded itself. One can talk about that, but it's really created the impression in Turkey that they're being left out, that they're being isolated, and that I think is one of the reasons why they've reacted so aggressively in the region in terms of pursuing their own exploration programs in the East Med, in terms of their own rhetoric towards the region and towards Greece as well. Let me just say a few final thoughts on US strategy in the EU. The US strategy, I think from the beginning, it's thought about this region in energy terms in the context of European energy security, because that's kind of what matters in this town. It's very difficult to get Washington to think about European energy or East Med energy without getting the conversation to turn and be about Russia, right? That's just kind of how Washington thinks. I don't think it's a good way of thinking about it. I'm just describing what it is. And so that's been one effort of trying to encourage collaboration, but not doing anything, just kind of like seeing that countries are meeting with one another and encouraging that. But we are definitely going to see a shift in terms of energy strategy and climate, right? The Trump administration framed its approach under the banner of energy dominance. It was very aggressive. It used trade and sanctions, and it was very much about sort of promoting US oil and gas. A Biden administration, I think, will have a much more climate and energy transition focus. It's not going to be going around talking about, how can we build more pipelines? It's not really going to be thinking about the exploitation of these hydrocarbons, unless it serves a broader sort of regional purpose, as in the context, for example, of the Cyprus dispute. But I think the final, and I'll end on this, I think the final shift that we have seen is also on the EU side. And I think what you're seeing over the last sort of 6 months is the EU has always had a focus on energy security. It's spent a lot of money and it's spent a lot of regulatory attention to change the European energy market, to build infrastructure. And it's always been interested in the East Med as a source potentially of new gas to diversify the European gas system. And I think now with the shift to the EU Green Deal, all that is more or less gone. The idea that the East Med was going to be sort of a new source of gas for Europe, and that therefore it deserves diplomatic attention, deserves money, that's just not really how Brussels talks about energy anymore. They don't even talk about energy in the same way that they for other parts of the European energy system. So I think whatever hope there was that European capital and public money was going to come in to link this region, especially around gas, I think that moment has sort of passed from an EU perspective as well. So again, I think it forces us to think about the region and how it adapts and how it sort of tries to tie itself to the new wave, which is really about climate and the energy transition, not necessarily the frame of, how do we become a source of gas to diversify European supplies away from Russia, which I think in some ways has been the discussion point, even if in reality, most of the gas has really stayed in the region. So I'll stop there, but happy to go into any of those things in detail.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tsafos. I'm actually going to pass it on to our facilitator, Dr. Vimbakis, for a couple minutes.
Well, thank you. Very nice presentations, and it just as you're both speaking on this issue of climate change and energy, and Dr. Tsafos places it in 2009 and gives us a framework. I just keep thinking of like this, this Benjamin Barber imperatives of ecology and energy going back to the early 1990s. And it seems like this issue of climate awareness and energy need has been with us for some time, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when again Russia was sort of like changing. It has changed everything around it, and even the points that Dr. Tsafos made as far as the U.S. after 2009, maybe it wasn't Donald Trump that was initiating and was proclaiming the U.S. independence, but there were issues in the U.S. as far as even previous administrations that were going towards making the U.S. energy independent, even before the implementation and the actualization of it in the Trump years. And a lot of times when we're looking at climate or we're looking at energy, we're looking at them in separate terms. But I can't stop to think that, I believe it was Dr. Tsafos that mentioned that energy follows politics, but it seems like the other way around in many ways as far as the Eastern Mediterranean is concerned. And we almost have like a tragedy of the commons in the region, in the fact that, there is a resource there. It takes very political dimensions because it becomes just another thing to fight over. It's just another one of those points. And the point is well taken as far as what's there. Is it enough? And I really like the point that Dr. Tsafos makes again, in the fact that if you're looking at the Eastern Med from a global energy perspective, it's completely insignificant. It's not necessarily that big of an area. But it brings us to the point that Ambassador Aviram makes, especially when he brings us to look at what's going on in Ethiopia and Egypt, and says, well, this is not an Eastern Mediterranean issue, but it connects to the Mediterranean. So this issue of energy and climate, how those things are interconnected, is very, very important to the region. And one of the sources, I think we're always fascinated in different ways as far as the energy is concerned. When we talk about energy, we're talking about fossil fuels or renewables, and we don't necessarily talk about nuclear, for instance, because nuclear in our head is only militarized. It's not necessarily for civilian purposes. And I'd like to ask both of you, into the issue of nuclear, because I know that both Egypt and Turkey are building nuclear power plants, and as alternative, the nuclear alternative, and it's more of a proliferation of nuclear energy in the region. but we usually see it as from a military perspective. So how is that balancing out? Like, how do we depoliticize the issue of energy to the point that we are looking really on alternatives other than what we already have, this path dependency in the way that we look at energy and climate in the way that has been framed over the last 30 years? I guess that's my question to both of you before we turn it over to others.
I'm happy to take a first pass at that. I think there's, if we think about, depoliticization of energy, I think of that as that's a different beast than, how do you talk about decarbonization and moving away from fossil fuels, right? Because you can, as I said, most of the resources in the region are not in any contested areas, right? So there's no resource that is sort of where two countries are saying, this is mine. All the discoveries that have been made are within the exclusive economic zone of an individual country and not contested. There's one exception. One field goes between Cyprus and Israel. But my point is that this is not a new problem. I mean, we've had this problem all over the world. I mean, if grown-ups can sit on a table and say, you get 70%, I get 30% because it's more on your side than it is on mine. So technically, we know how to solve this. This isn't a particularly difficult problem. You just have to have the political willingness to sit down and find a solution. And in some ways, I think that, when I look at the disputes between Greece and Turkey, for instance, sometimes having something tangible can actually be helpful because it's very hard to fight over sovereignty and to divide sovereignty and to divide national pride. It's much easier to divide a resource and say, here's something tangible, you get something, I get something. So oddly enough, sometimes the presence of hydrocarbons can create a prize and a tangibility that makes it easier to resolve. I think on the energy transition more broadly, the way I think about it, and again, this is a whole other conversation, but we have a series of technologies and a series of policies that we need to do and implement over the next 20, 30 years. And the question is, most of what is commercially available becomes commercially available because of government policy, government incentives, scaling up the production. And so for a region like the East Med, it's probably not going to be at the forefront of driving these new technologies, but the goal, I think, is to be an early adopter, right? That as things become more competitive and more commercially available, that you adopt them faster. We've seen this in Israel, by the way, where renewable energy is really sort of taking off, and in fact, leading the government to revise some of its plans about how much gas it wants to use in the country, right? So that, I think, is a more realistic strategy for smaller economies that aren't, the US and Germany and China and Japan, where you would expect them to sort of pick a number of technologies and try to advance them, even though there's always a role for smaller countries to play a niche role in technologies. On nuclear, the challenge, I think, for nuclear has been that it's been very expensive for a long time, putting aside the proliferation challenges. So we do have some nuclear happening in the region. I happen to think that the role is going to be small, not because of non-proliferation, but largely because these are just very big projects. They're very expensive. They take a long time to build. And you kind of have to show that they can be developed at a timely and cost-effective way. And we haven't really seen that yet. We've seen a lot of stops and starts, whether it's in Turkey or in Egypt. But I think we do have to have a more serious conversation that a lot of the nuclear in the world is being built by Russia. And I think that is something that we should be spending a little bit more time thinking about.
Well, let me take your last phrase by talking about Russia and understanding why I would come to the same conclusion as you, that I don't think that nuclear will play a major role. I think that the issue of proliferation comes out very boldly, because you cannot build it without having the right infrastructure in terms of knowledge, in terms of engineering, in terms of experience. And it is not, you know, you come and build the factory to produce something and you go home. A good French company doing that and goes home. And also because somehow, at least in our region, it played a role in the, let's call it, in the steps of proliferation. When people say, like Iran, which is, it's only civil needs. And so you would say that being paranoid is that from time to time, somebody is really chasing you. And the use of nuclear for civil needs has been used for other purposes. I also think that, you know, it's a matter of fashion, the nuclear. There were times that it was a hype, and there was time that people were looking at the problems. If I may take an example, again, in the field of water to understand what we are talking about, Israel and Jordan are building together a desalination plant in Aqaba. This desalination plant is aimed at supplying water mainly to the Israeli side, but it is built on the Jordanian side. It is a Jordanian desalination plant, and we have done a kind of a regional swap of water where we are going to buy water down in Aqaba for the Araba Valley and Eilat, and we will supply in the same price or another price, the same quantity of water up north where Jordan needs it for Amman and the center of the population. One of the issues that we were dealing with between us and Jordan in a very open way is the need to ensure the Israeli buyer that all the, I would say, all the precautions, I'm trying to be, all the precautions are being taken throughout the life of such a plant without being hindering in any way safety and healthy on the other side. Now, can you imagine what the feeling would be if, let's take Lebanon, it's a good example, would start building a nuclear facility with, I'm not talking now strategically, not proliferation, but only for the sake of safety. So, you know, we are not unique on that. I remember very vividly the fight between Denmark and Sweden on a nuclear facility not far away from Copenhagen on the Swedish side. Nikos most probably know it better than me, but there was a big row there. And it's Denmark and Sweden, till Sweden had no other choice but to close the nuclear facility in Malmö. So I don't think that even if environmentally it is good, we will see it coming up.
All right, thank you so much. I believe Dr. Prodroma would like to ask a question.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Dylan, and thank you so much, Ambassador Aviram, and also to Dr. Tsafos for really sharpening our the lens on how we think about energy resources in the Eastern Med. And I wanted to ask about the relatively, I guess, iconoclastic picture that that you outlined, Nico, where you basically, said that, the discussion about Eastern Med energy is much ado about nothing, if I were to, put it in the colloquial, other than for the countries in the immediate region. And yet, if we compare that to also Ambassador Aviram's presentation, it's clear we need to distinguish between types of energy resources. So I appreciate that distinction, but I also wanted to ask if indeed the significance of natural gas, at least in the Eastern Med, is relatively insignificant when it comes to energy markets and energy assessments. What's really driving then the mediatization and politicization of the energy question? You mentioned that it's really all about Turkey exclusion, inclusion, whether real or perceived, whether self-driven or other-driven. Is that the whole issue with Turkey? And the second piece of the question is, how deep then is the putative, I would say collaboration, cooperation amongst all of the other regions' energy partners? Or is it as thin and unremarkable in substance as the energy issues itself? Because if we were to take on the surface what we read and hear every day, we would conclude that Egypt, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, have a deepening partnership when it comes to energy and beyond. And I wonder if energy is really just just a superficial representation of what might be something deeper or something that is equally thin.
Nico, if you don't mind, I will jump in first this time. I would refer to, you have two questions. How important it is? Well, for the states, each and every one of them, it is very important. Maybe when you are far away and looking at the region and asking yourself, will the world be saved by East Mediterranean energy? Well, the answer is definitely no, as Nikos said quite clearly, and I agree with him. But when you are looking at the interest of each of the players, then it is very significant. If I take Israel, for example, a country that suffered for many years with the dependency on energy from places that others looked at in a very natural way. Israel had no access whatsoever to oil from the Gulf, neither to gas from the Gulf. And until, the Norwegian fields, the British fields, the Nigerian fields were developed, it was not there. So suddenly, after very many years, I was the chief of staff of Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres used to say many times, I don't understand this Moses, who were looking for the only place in the Middle East for us to sit in that there is no energy resources whatsoever. And this reflects on the meaning of what it is for a country like Israel to be less dependent on whatever comes from the outside, especially in a strategic thing like energy. Of course, this is not the situation in the last 15 years, as I said, others, but this is one. Secondly, it is a pretext for what I would put as an important thing, and that's ethos. Even when we come in the Hebrew diplomacy to deal with water issues, what we are looking at, what I'm at least preaching to look at, is the ethos. And only afterwards, what the real meaning of whatever is there, because I agree 100% when Dr. Tsafos said that it is easier to divide a resource than a sovereignty. But the ethos issues are there. I see it, and I will take you into a bit larger resolution between Israel and Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon are now negotiating the embarkation of the naval of the ocean border between them. And the area that is in dispute is very, very small. But it is the one that if it will not be solved, Lebanon will not be able to use its own gas fields. None of the investors will come to an area which is disputed between Israel and Lebanon until it is solved. Now, think now on Lebanon after the explosion in the harbor, with no government, and there is a kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, at least from energy as a source also of money in that sense. And you will understand how important it is for Lebanon as such. Now, if you want to see how complicated it is, think that the Hezbollah is there. And the Hezbollah says, this is not a civilian issue. We are not negotiating with Israel on a civilian issue. But from the beginning, it is only the Lebanese army that will negotiate with Israel, because with enemies like Israel, we do not deal with civil issues. Now, this is small, even in the East Mediterranean, but when you are looking at the overall continental shelf between Turkey and Greece and what it means, and you understand the ethos on which Greek government were falling on, let alone Greece as representative of the EU in that sense, representative in quotation marks, because at least being in the front of it. So you understand the importance of it. Now, as for your second question, how deep it is, since I would I feel that along the years, it becomes more and more deep. Even if it started in a shallow way, that was the incidents between Israel and Turkey. Turkey is not Israel, Israel and Greece as that, but along the years, and I would mention only two things which I think are significant to show. One, we were through 4.5, almost 5 years of Syriza in power, a leftist government that was the greatest critic of any relations with Israel, and the relations were only deepening during this period. It is not anymore a matter of which government is ruling Greece that says, yes, we would like to keep on the relations with. Two, last week, an agreement for 20 years of Israel actually running all the administration of the Greek pilot courses has been signed. It's an agreement for 20 years. This is not an incidental issue. If you add to that Egypt and the agreement with Greece over the economic zone, whatever it means in practical terms, the fact that Egypt was there for Greece speaks for itself. So maybe not energy alone, but along the years it is accumulated.
Ambassador Aviram, could I just ask one follow-up before we go to Nikos? And that is has energy then in some ways been a kind of trial balloon, a test balloon that's been used by the various states in the region to see about the recalibration of their relations with one another, and using it as a means, as a kind of runway for these other more significant strategic shifts that you just described?
I think so. At a certain time, I became even cynical, because every prime minister in Greece would say, don't worry, we are laying down the East Mediterranean pipeline, and all the gas in the world from Leviathan and Tamar and what's not would go through Greece to Europe, and Greece would become the hub of gas. I think it was a kind of a bite at the end of the road. And people show, don't worry. By the way, it goes the same now for the electrical connection between Israel and Cyprus and Greece. I feel they're the same pattern, but it works.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
So I agree a lot, and I think the phrase trial balloon or sort of stepping stone, I think is a good way to think about it. Right. So if I put on my hat as an energy analyst and I say, what energy outcomes have changed? What projects have been developed or resources have been developed, new trade routes? As a result of this collaboration, the answer is probably nothing. But again, I go back to my opening statement. If the alternative is bad relations, no relations, shallow relations, deep relations, I'll take shallow relation. Like, it's much better because that has the potential to become something deeper. And again, after you meet with someone 7 times and you never do anything, eventually you say, well, why don't we also talk about this? So it helps to build something. So that, I don't take any issue with that. And insofar as it allows the countries to sort of regularly meet and explore areas of partnership, I think that's good, as long as we, keep our expectations in place. And in particular, I think one thing that worries me, and I'm going to go back to Turkey now, is that there is also a cost to that, though, right? And I think that is one of the things that I wish policymakers appreciated. When you do all this optics and you meet and you pretend like you have an incredible collaboration, even if you don't, if there was no one on the other side, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But there is someone on the other side who thinks you're ganging up on them, right? And so there is a cost to that. And I'm not saying that the cost is not worth it. That's a whole other conversation. But there is a downside to that, which is that Turkey feels that everyone is getting together and they're doing these amazing things and they're being left out. And whether it's real or not, it's definitely how Erdogan perceives it. I'm a little bit active on social media, and one of the things that I said that drew the most wrath from folks from Turkey on Twitter was sort of downplaying their exploration program at the East Med. And there's just so much pride that they just made a discovery in the Black Sea. I haven't seen quite as much sort of national pride from a discovery made. So I think there is this sense that just like Turkey will be great if we can find energy, right? And I think Erdogan believes it. Whether it's true, I don't think it's true, but he definitely believes it. And I think there's definitely a political constituency in Turkey that believes it, whether it's true or not. So I do think that this feeling of being left out, of everyone meeting without you, of your interests not really being taken into account, I think Turkey also was very frustrated that no one really took it seriously as a market. They think, we're the biggest market. They're not, Egypt is, but they think of, we're the biggest market. Why doesn't anyone want to sell gas to us? And the answer is largely commercial rather than political. It's also political. But I think they felt like, we're the big, like, you should want to come to us. We are the big growing market. And so I think, again, regardless of whether it's true or not, it's definitely fed that impression. And I do think that, when I see last month, the UAE joining the East Med Gas Forum, as a gas analyst, I'm like, what the hell is that? I mean, there's no gas agenda that the UAE is helpful, but it's their way of positioning themselves regionally vis-a-vis Turkey, right? And so that worries me, because then you have a club that is basically calls itself a gas forum, but it's kind of a forum of like pro against Turkey. And if we had a good strategy for dealing with Turkey, I wouldn't mind that, but we don't. And so we need to find a way to sort of de-escalate or recalibrate the relationship. And I worry sometimes that leads to more tension rather than de-escalation.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Fascinating.
Oh, right. So we do have some questions here in the Q&A box. So one is from Ilyana, and I believe this is directed towards Ambassador Aviram. So they go over how the Euphrates crosses through all these national boundaries, and with this development, there's been a lot of anger. Can this be a source for conflict in the future? And the second part of their question is, could investing in desalinization technology be as profitable as investing in the other more polluting exploitation of resources? And yeah, so that's the question.
Right. I think that the Tigris and Euphrates is a source of a conflict, not in the future, but in every day that passes. And actually, it is almost 3,000 years, not in the context of Turkey, but these two rivers were always a kind of a source for a conflict. the issue of the exploitation of Turkey, both the Tigris and the Euphrates, is of great concern, not only in Syria but also in Iraq, because the diminishing of the quantity and the quality because there is lots of drainage from the agricultural field into the water, and the water actually reach these two countries in a very bad shape. I can hardly think of I would say an all-out war. I do not even see violence around it, but I can see this as a place that should be addressed by whoever tries to put calm and stabilization in North Syria, must look into the issue of the Euphrates and the Tigris and suggest ways to overcome the problem. It is not only Turkey, of course, it is the issue of longer periods of drought in the last 20 years that causes it. But there are ways and means to overcome it. If we invest more by having better agricultural technologies, then maybe the same amount of water can be used to have the same quantity of food and agricultural crops. So it is, I'm taking it as an issue that must be addressed both for Syria and Iraq. And I know that in Iraq, it becomes even more and more dire situation, even when we are talking about Syria. Of course, Syria, part of the problem is no central government, etc., etc. Concerning the second question on desalination, desalination as such is the last resort of getting more water, because whatever you do, water that are being produced are more expensive than water that you find in nature. So opting for desalination needs a whole series of prior actions in order to get to desalination only when you don't have other ways to have the water, which means reforms, which means being economically viable, which means using wastewater and reused water, using technology for less quality of water to be used for irrigation, all those things. And then when you still don't have enough water, then you opt for desalination. The experience in Israel since we inaugurated our first one in 2006 until today, where we are actually supplying more, around 70% of domestic needs in Israel are being supplied through desalination, is a very good experience. Of course, there are always long-term ramifications that until now we don't know them, because we use more than 80% of our wastewater for irrigation. So if this water comes from desalinated water, you actually in the cycle use them for irrigation as well, and their chemical composition is different of what you find in nature. But until now, in 15 years, large quantity, we have not seen it, and the desalination made a major positive change in the Israeli water market.
All right, excellent, thank you. So the next question we have is from Nikos Bakirtis. So we would like to thank both speakers. His question is, overall, do you think the gas reserves in the fields in the East Mediterranean worth the time and resources that the country spend? He sort of frames this question based around the multiple conflicting interests in the region amongst countries.
Yeah, let me take a first pass at that. I think the answer I would give is very context and region and country and dispute specific, right? So, has Israel gained from exploring and exploiting its hydrocarbon resources? Absolutely, right? It's made, as the ambassador said, a huge improvement in its national security and its energy security. It has made great improvements in terms of the environment and carbon pollution and local air pollution. Fiscally, it's not that huge of a deal. If you look at like how much revenue the Israeli state earns from these resources, it's not a lot of money. It's a few $100 million. If you look at the current account, it's a bigger impact. So I'm a big proponent of sort of try to think in concrete terms, and also to understand the realism of what it takes to develop these resources, right? I mean, I grew up in Greece. I follow the Greek discourse, and I think every Greek is convinced that there's just like this enormous prize that if only we could get Turkey out of the way, we would make this boatload of money that's going to get us out of the crisis and all that. And that's all rubbish, right? None of that stuff is grounded in reality. So the examples I would give is, you had a major discovery in Cyprus in 2011. 2011, it hasn't been developed yet, and there's no plan to develop it. Quite possibly, it might never be developed. When I go to the disputes, I've written, you can go on the website of CSIS about the disputes in the East Med. There's probably like 4 different maritime disputes that involve Turkey and either Greece or Cyprus. And so the answer I would give on, is it worth it, kind of depends on which dispute we're talking about. But if I can look at the dispute that's been most inflammatory this summer, the area south of Castellorizo, sometimes to be honest, I don't really understand what the Greek interest is there. What is the hope that, as a gas analyst, if you told me you found some gas south of Castellorizo and you want to develop it for the Greek market, I really hope you found one of the largest fields in the history of the planet, because otherwise that stuff is not going to be commercial to develop. And I just hope that those conversations would be more prevalent in the public discourse as we talk about costs and benefits of what each side wants, what it hopes to accomplish, rather than just vaguely talking about amazing things that are going to be transformative, when in reality, they might be, but most likely they will not. So that's sort of the way I hope that we would talk about this issue.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that there is a big gap between expectation. That is why what I said before and you said, the ethos is more important, because it reflects on other issues as well. Looking at Israel and Lebanon, and we have not mentioned Syria at all, gas is significant. For Egypt, the gas is significant. If I'm not mistaken, there was time that Egypt actually forbid the export of gas out of Egypt in order to keep it for future generations. So it is not necessarily looking at it on the regional basis, but as you said, on a country by country. And when it comes to Greece, the truth is that we don't know. That's the issue. There was never, they never got to a real serious exploration effort. Even at places without of course, south of Crete is the most talkable place, but we have not seen it happen. And maybe you were very right, Nico, by saying, well, commercially we have to think what is better than having this pipeline coming from Turkey, solving our problems under the economic situation as it is. Yeah, energy is a great issue to deal with, but you have to see what it is.
Excellent. I had a question of my own. Dr. Tsafos, you had mentioned how energy is not necessarily going to engender good relations between sort of disputing nations. My question is with because the Abraham Accords are going to come up in the next sort of topic we discuss. How much has like hydropolitics influenced this sort of realignment in the region? Has that, because I'm sort of thinking about the image of Jordan that Ambassador Aviram shared, very parched country. Is that sort of changing the dynamics in the region and sort of forging new alliances? So either of you can answer that.
Can I, let me take a first crack at this, just to defend myself when I say that energy, what I said about energy and politics. I am a student of sort of international affairs. And so I always try to think, if my question is, if I'm trying to explain political outcomes, war and peace, good relations, bad relations, deep relations, cordial relations, or antagonistic relations, if that's my question, I want to understand if two countries, will they have a good relationship or a bad relationship? And then I try to use as an input their energy relationship. I can give you enough examples for any combination possible. I can give you an example of countries that used energy to break the ice and to start sort of developing a little bit of a political relationship. You can go back to even the Soviet Union and supplying gas to Austria and slowly to Germany, West Germany. I can give you examples of countries that hated each other and they still traded in energy. The United States, imported oil from Venezuela until very recently, even though their political relationship was terrible. I can give you, even Russia and Ukraine, continue to have an energy relationship despite the political tension between them. If you think back, I started my talk with 2009 saying that Egypt was at the time supplying gas to Israel. And in part, this was conceived as a political measure, right? It was designed as a source to bring the countries together. And it did until it didn't. It did until Mubarak was toppled, and then people started complaining about the deal because they thought Egypt had been cheated, and the Muslim Brotherhood started blowing up the pipeline, and then the exports stopped. So what I'm trying to get at is, I think it's very difficult to make an a priori statement that because of an energy relationship, we can expect a certain political relationship to follow. I'm not saying that it can't, it can, but I can give you a lot of examples where countries trade with one another in energy and their relationship politically is horrible. And I can also give you examples of countries that have tried to use energy to build a relationship, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. You can see from Russia and Ukraine, when the political relationship is good, the energy relationship is good. When the political relationship turns bad, the energy relationship turns bad. The only time that Ukraine has had its gas cut off is when there was a pro-West government in Ukraine, right? If there's a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, no one is cutting anyone's gas off, right? So what I'm trying to get at is, as we are students of politics, to just try to understand the contextual factors that might lead you in one way or another, and to appreciate that, Greece has been importing gas from Turkey, really from Azerbaijan, but from Turkey since 2007. And so when people say, oh, we're going to have TAP now, we have regional collaboration, it's like, you've been doing this for 14 years. I haven't read a lot of articles talking about how this has improved Greek-Turkish relations, right? But if you build a new pipeline, people will say these things. So my thing is just a caution as to the conclusions that we draw, to make sure that they are grounded in fact and what the history shows us.
I can see that we are coming towards the end of our talk, so I will try to be very concise in what I say. I would like to take your question into the operational side, and not in my head as an academic, and I take my head because I'm teaching a lot hydrodiplomacy, but I put on my hydrodiplomatic hat, because this is what I've done for many years, and actually I'm doing nowadays. we, the hydro diplomats, are looking at the resource as a resource for relations. And we are looking for the ways to use it in order to move from one place to the other. One place to the other does not mean necessarily always for better relations. It can be used for other things as well. But the resource as such, it can be John water, it can be energy, it can be actually every resource that you can think of, is a tool of achieving your overall goal. And by looking at the resource in that way, most probably you will find that you can use it if you own it, or if you are in the supply chain, because otherwise you don't have any resource to trade with. America, for that sense, is the owner of the finance and the technology and the big companies that can assist in doing one thing or another. Can you think of America in between Ethiopia and Egypt finding ways to relax Egypt of its worries? And there are very many ways, not by giving another billion cubic meter of water, but by giving, for example, virtual water through grains, which has been done for years and years. So I think we should look at all those things in the broader perspective, operationally, how it serves what we want to achieve. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Very insightful comments. We really appreciate your presentations. We are at the end of our time. We all expect to see you all in a few hours where we will be talking about the Abrahamic Accords. All right, thank you all so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Nico.
Thank you so much.